Deep in the heart of Louisiana's forgotten bayous, where the air hung thick with the scent of decay and the whisper of ancient cypress trees, a fog rolled in like a shroud over the still waters. Elijah Thorne had come here chasing shadows, stories traded in dimly lit bars about a family that time itself seemed to have abandoned. The road twisted narrower with each mile, the pavement giving way to mud-slicked paths that sucked at his tires like hungry mouths. He gripped the wheel tighter, the radio crackling with static before dying altogether, leaving only the chorus of insects and the distant croak of gators to fill the silence. The town of Blackwater wasn't on any map worth its salt, a cluster of weathered shacks clinging to the edge of the swamp like barnacles on a rotting hull. Folks here didn't take kindly to outsiders, their eyes narrowing under sagging brows as Elijah asked his questions. "You best turn back, son," an old-timer muttered over a glass of murky moonshine, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "The LaRues, they ain't right. Been keeping to themselves for generations, Mayan kin, whisperin' to things in the dark. People go missing out there, and what comes back, well, it ain't whole." But Elijah pressed on, his notebook filling with fragments, tales of malformed children glimpsed at dusk, screams echoing across the water on moonless nights, boats found adrift with blood-stained decks. The pull was irresistible, a gnawing curiosity that drowned out the warnings. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised purples, he steered his skiff into the labyrinth of channels, the water black as oil beneath him. Vines dangled like nooses, brushing his face, and somewhere in the distance, a low, guttural chant rose and fell with the tide. He didn't see the figure at first, just a ripple in the murk, then a pale hand breaking the surface. It emerged slowly, water streaming from ragged clothes, eyes gleaming with a feral hunger that sent ice through his veins. The thing, man, grinned, teeth jagged and stained, and in that moment, Elijah knew he'd crossed into a world where the line between family and monster blurred into something unspeakable. The swamp seemed to close in, alive with secrets that hungered for flesh, and as the boat drifted deeper, the true horror began to unfold. Elijah Thorne had spent 15 years chasing ghosts across the American South, filing stories about haunted plantations, voodoo queens, and backwoods cults that most editors dismissed as folklore. But the whispers about the LaRue family were different. They didn't come from drunk tourists or sensationalist podcasts. They came from missing persons reports that quietly vanished from police databases, from coroners who refused to discuss certain bodies found half-submerged in the Atchafalaya Basin, from old women who crossed themselves when the name was spoken. He first heard it in a Baton Rouge bar from a game warden with scarred hands and eyes that wouldn't meet his. "You want a real story," the man had rasped, sliding a crumpled photograph across the sticky table. It showed a grainy Polaroid of what looked like a child, except the proportions were wrong, limbs too long, neck too thick, eyes set too far apart beneath a heavy brow. That was taken in '98. Fishermen swore it watched him from the reeds for 20 minutes before it slipped back under. Never found the camera again. Just this picture, mailed to the station with no return address. The warden had leaned in then, voice dropping to barely a whisper. "They call 'em the swamp kin. Been out there since before the Civil War, marrying cousins, sisters, whatever keeps the blood pure, they say. Folks who go looking don't come back the same. Some don't come back at all." Elijah had stared at that photograph for hours afterward, the image burning behind his eyelids. This wasn't another Bigfoot hoax or Weeping Virgin Mary statue. This was something older, something that had learned to hide in plain sight among the cypress knees and hanging moss. By morning, he'd cleared his schedule, packed a single duffel bag, and pointed his battered jeep south toward the place where maps ended and the water began to remember things men had tried to forget. Blackwater clung to the edge of the swamp like a scab that refused to heal. The single street was nothing more than cracked asphalt bleeding mud, lined with shotgun houses whose tin roofs rattled in the damp wind. Elijah parked outside the only place still open after dark, a cinderblock bar called the Gator's Last Drink, its neon sign half burnt out so the alligator looked like it was screaming. Inside, the air tasted of stale beer and fryer grease. Conversation died the moment he crossed the threshold, even the jukebox seemed to lower its voice. He felt every eye track him as he slid onto a stool, the vinyl cracked and sticky beneath his palms. The bartender, a woman with a face like weathered driftwood and a name tag that read Dell, poured him a beer without asking. He laid a 20 on the bar and spoke the name he'd come to speak. LaRue. The room went colder. A man at the end of the bar spat tobacco juice into a Folgers can and muttered something that sounded like prayer. Dell wiped the same spot on the counter over and over, eyes fixed on the rag. They don't like their name said out loud, she finally said, voice low. Been that way since my grandma's time. Folks used to trade with them, fish, moonshine, whatever. Then one winter the trading stopped. Boats came back empty. Or didn't come back. Another man, older, skin the color of dried blood, leaned over from a booth. My brother went out there in 74. Said he saw lights dancin' where no lights should be. Heard St. too, high and wrong, like a hymn played backwards. Found his boat 3 days later. Seat was warm. Blood still wet. No brother. Dell's rag stopped moving. They keep to the old channels now. Places the water forgets. You hear a baby cry out there at night, you row the other way. That ain't no baby. She glanced toward the black windows, as if saying it might summon them. Some things are better left hungry. Elijah left the gator's last drink with the taste of iron in his mouth and a folded scrap of paper burning against his palm. Dell had pressed it into his hand without looking at him, her fingers trembling. It was a hand-drawn map, faded and water-stained, the ink bleeding into the creases like bruises. A single red X marked a place no official chart acknowledged, deep in the maze of dead-end sloughs and cypress islands where even the fish and wildlife boys refused to run their patrols. He slept 3 hours in the jeep, waking before dawn with the map spread across the steering wheel and the photograph of the wrong-faced child propped against the dash. The morning was the color of old nickels, the air so thick he could chew it. Mosquitoes whined against the windshield like tiny saws. He loaded the skiff he'd rented from a man who wouldn't take his money until Elijah promised, twice, that he was only going fishing. The outboard coughed to life and he slipped away from the dock while Blackwater still slept off its fear. The channel narrowed fast. Within minutes the last house disappeared behind curtains of Spanish moss that hung like funeral lace. He followed the map's crooked lines, poling when the water grew shallow and black, the bottom sucking at the aluminum hull with wet, greedy kisses. Dragonflies the size of sparrows darted ahead of him, their wings ticking against the silence. Time loosened out here. The sun climbed but never quite burned away the haze. He passed rusted oil drums half sunk in the reeds, a child's plastic tricycle tangled in vines, the ribs of something large and long dead gleaming white above the waterline. Each marker matched a faint pencil note on Dell's map, as though someone had once walked this route and left breadcrumbs for the damned. By midday the channel split into a dozen identical veins. Elijah cut the engine and let the skiff drift, sweat stinging his eyes while he studied the red X. It was close now. He could feel it in the way the air pressed heavier, in the sudden absence of birdsong. Somewhere ahead, the swamp was holding its breath. The skiff glided into a lagoon no wider than a suburban driveway, cypress knees rising around it like the bars of a drowned cage. Elijah killed the engine and let momentum carry him under a low arch of branches. The water here was mirror still, reflecting the sky in perfect, poisonous green. He reached for the pole to push away from a half-submerged log when the log moved. It wasn't a log. A shape unfolded from the shadows with the slow patience of something that had never needed to hurry. First a shoulder, then a head too large for the neck beneath it, skin the color of spoiled milk and mottled with sores that never quite scabbed. The eyes were small, set deep beneath a ridge of bone, but they caught what little light there was and threw it back red. The mouth hung open, lips split and black, revealing teeth filed to uneven points that overlapped like a shark's. The thing, man, once, crouched on a root knob no more than 10 feet off the bow, naked except for a necklace of finger bones threaded on rusted wire. Water dripped from matted hair that reached its waist. It tilted its head the way a dog does when it hears a new sound, and Elijah felt the pole slip from his numb fingers. When it spoke, the voice came out wet, as though its tongue were too thick for the cavity. "You smell like road," it rasped, nostrils flaring wide enough to show the raw pink inside. "Road meat walks soft." Elijah's hand crept toward the flare gun tucked under the seat. The creature's grin widened, splitting further, a second row of smaller teeth glinting behind the first. "Ma's waiting," it said, almost tenderly. "She likes 'em curious." Then it was simply gone, slipping sideways into the water without a splash, leaving only ripples that spread and died too quickly. The necklace of bones bobbed once on the surface before vanishing. Elijah sat frozen, heart hammering so hard he tasted blood, staring at the place where the thing had been until the lagoon itself seemed to watch him back. The sky cracked open an hour later, a Louisiana storm that turned day to night in one savage clap of thunder. Rain came sideways, thick as buckshot, drumming the skiff until the hull rang like a bell. Elijah barely managed to nose the boat under an overhang of cypress before the wind tried to flip him. Lightning strobed white, freezing the swamp in stuttered photographs. Black water, blacker trees, things moving between them too quick for the eye to hold. He spotted the shack on the third flash, a crooked silhouette perched on stilts above a side channel, boards silvered with age and rot. One window glowed faint orange, the color of a dying coal. He tied the painter to a root and waded ashore, boots sinking ankle-deep in sucking mud. The rain tasted of iron and swamp gas. The door hung open on leather hinges. Inside, the air was warmer, heavy with the reek of tallow and something coppersweet underneath. A single lard lamp burned on a crate, throwing shadows that crawled across walls papered in yellowed newspaper clippings, headlines about missing hunters, drowned children, bodies found with parts rearranged. Shelves lined the far wall, row upon row of mason jars clouded with age. Elijah lifted one. Inside floated a pale, curled thing the size of a fetus, lidless eyes staring up through murky fluid. Another held a tongue, thick and grey, pierced with fishhooks. A third, larger jar contained what looked like braided hair until he saw the tiny finger bones knotted into the strands. On the floor beneath the shelves lay a scatter of human teeth, some still pink at the root, arranged in crude concentric circles. In the center rested a child's shoe, leather cracked and dark with old blood. The lamp flame guttered though there was no wind, and for a moment the teeth seemed to twitch, rearranging themselves into a smile. He backed toward the door and felt something soft give beneath his heel. A low, wet chuckle rose from the corner he hadn't noticed, too human and too wrong at once. The storm outside swallowed the sound, but the shack had already decided he wasn't leaving dry. They came out of the rain like something the swamp had been saving for a special occasion. First the net, coarse rope woven from kudzu vine and human sinew, dropping from the rafters and cinching around his torso before he could raise the flare gun. Then the bodies, pale and slick, moving with the silent coordination of a wolf pack. Hands that ended in too many joints pinned his arms, fingers that smelled of mud and grave rot forced a rag soaked in something sweet and chemical over his mouth. He bit down, tasted blood that wasn't his, and still the dark rushed in. He woke slung over a shoulder, the world bobbing upside down, rain needling his face. The one carrying him moved with a loping gait that made bones creak audibly inside its skin. Others flanked them, barefoot on the submerged boards of a hidden causeway, their breathing wet and eager. Lanterns swung from poles, throwing circles of sickly light across faces that shared the same broken architecture, low foreheads, wide cheekbones, eyes too small and too pale, mouths crowded with teeth that had never known a dentist. They brought him to a clearing where the water never quite reached. A compound of sorts, shacks stitched together with sheet metal and animal hides, all orbiting a larger structure raised on cypress stumps like a crude temple. Smoke rose from a dozen cookfires, carrying the smell of fat and spices and something that made Elijah's stomach clench with recognition. In the center stood the patriarch. He was taller than the rest, spine curved but unbroken, skin hanging in loose folds over muscle that had forgotten how to die. One eye was milky, the other sharp as a gator's. He wore a coat made from faces, tanned and stitched with the hair still attached, and when he smiled the expression reached every mask at once. "Welcome, traveler," he crooned, voice soft as a lullaby and thick as river silt. "Blood calls to blood. Tonight we keep it pure." Behind him, chained to the temple posts, a dozen more waited, some older than sin, some barely past childhood, all sharing the same ruined beauty, all watching Elijah with the patient hunger of things that had never once been told no. They dragged him inside the temple on his knees, past walls hung with drying skins that still carried the shape of shoulders and breasts. The floor was packed earth slick with old grease, every footstep made a soft, sucking sound. In the middle of the single room a pit had been dug, ringed with flat stones blackened by years of fire. Above it, on spits of green cypress, turned what had recently been a man. The body was opened from throat to groin, ribs cranked back like cupboard doors. Fat dripped and hissed into the coals, sending up sparks that smelled of pork and pennies. 2 women, sisters, maybe mother and daughter, impossible to tell, worked with practiced grace, slicing long pink strips from the thighs and laying them on a plank already crowded with meat. Their arms were painted to the elbow in blood that never quite dried in the humid air. Children squatted at the edges, naked and shining, passing bowls made from human skulls. They dipped fingers and licked them clean, eyes rolling white with pleasure. One offered Elijah a piece the size of a playing card, still twitching. When he turned his face away, the child giggled, a sound like wet gravel poured down a well, and crammed the morsel into its own mouth instead. At the head of the pit sat the patriarch on a throne of lashed bones. He carved the choicest cuts, liver, heart, the pale tenderloin along the spine, and fed them first to his favored daughters, who knelt and took the meat between broken teeth with the reverence of communion. Each swallow was followed by a low, communal hum that rose and fell like breathing. "See how we honor the gift," the old man said, voice carrying easily over the wet sounds of eating. "Nothing wasted. Nothing lost. The stranger gives strength to the line." A woman with a face like melted candle wax leaned close, breath hot and rank. She pressed a slice against Elijah's lips until blood ran down his chin. Her eyes were gentle, almost loving, as she whispered, "Taste where you're going." They kept him in a pen of woven palmetto and rusted chain link, roofed with corrugated tin that turned the days into ovens and the nights into drums of rain. Days bled together. He counted 3, maybe 4, by the number of times they dragged him out to watch the family feed. On the last evening the sky hung low and green, the air so thick with coming storm it felt like breathing soup. She came after moonrise, the youngest one they allowed near the pit, no more than 16, though her body carried the swollen belly of someone farther along. Her left arm ended in a knot of scar where fingers should have been, and her eyes were mismatched, one pale like the rest, the other a startling clear hazel that didn't belong in that face. She moved differently too, hesitant, as if pain were a language she hadn't fully learned. She slipped him water in a tin cup that still had someone's tooth rattling in the bottom. When he drank anyway, she crouched close enough that he smelled milk and blood on her skin. "They say you write things down," she whispered, voice soft and cracked from disuse. "You write what you see." He nodded, throat raw. She glanced toward the temple, where the patriarch's silhouette moved against firelight, then pressed something small and hard into his palm, a key made from a human thigh bone, carved and polished smooth. "Granddaddy keeps the first sin locked in the smokehouse," she breathed. "Mama says it started with a preacher who promised us forever if we stayed pure. He lied. We ate him, but the promise stuck." Her good hand brushed the swell of her belly, protective and ashamed at once. "This one kicks wrong already. I won't let them open it alive like they did my sister." Lightning flickered, showing the tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. "Take the sin out," she said. "Break it. Then run. Water remembers the way back if you give it blood that ain't ours." She pressed her forehead to the palmetto bars for one heartbeat, then melted into the dark before the guards' lanterns swung around. The storm broke while the family slept off their latest meal, bellies swollen and snoring in a tangle of limbs across the temple floor. Elijah worked the bone key with shaking fingers slicked by rain and his own blood, sawing at the rope until it parted with a wet pop. The pen door swung open on hinges that screamed like a dying bird, but thunder swallowed the sound. He ran barefoot through ankle-deep water that flashed silver with every lightning strike, following the girl's whispered directions, past the smokehouse with its padlock carved from a human jaw, past the pit where coals still glowed under a ribcage picked clean. The swamp had become a single living thing, wind ripping moss from the trees in long grey beards, rain needling so hard it drew blood from his scalp. Behind him the first shout rose, raw and inhuman, answered by a chorus that climbed into a howl. Lanterns flared to life across the compound like angry eyes. He heard the splash of pursuit, heavy bodies hitting water with the force of dropped carcasses. He found the old channel she'd spoken of, a narrow cut hidden under overhanging willow that the family never used because the water there ran blacker than elsewhere and never gave up its dead. He waded in to the waist, then the chest, the cold, shocking breath from his lungs. Something brushed his leg, hand or root, he couldn't tell, and he bit down on a scream. The chase spilled into the cut behind him. Shapes loped along the banks, pale against the dark, mouths open in that same backwoods hymn the warden had described decades ago. One leapt from a cypress knee and landed in the water ahead, turning with a grin full of moonlight. Elijah drove the bone key into its eye socket. The thing made a sound like a kettle boiling over and sank. He kept moving, lungs burning, the girl's words looping in his head, "Give it blood that ain't ours." He sliced his forearm on a broken bottle floating past and let the red ribbon trail behind him. The water took it greedily, and for one impossible moment the current reversed, pushing him forward while the howls behind grew distant, confused, then furious. The smokehouse door gave with a sigh of rot and old iron. Inside, the air was thick enough to chew, rank with tallow and something sweeter, like overripe fruit left in the sun. A single object rested on a stump altar, a heart, black and shriveled, suspended inside a cage of rib bones lashed together with silver wire. It still beat. Slow, deliberate pulses that made the ribs creak outward with every contraction, as though the thing inside were trying to grow large enough to wear them again. Elijah raised the rusted hatchet he'd taken from the pen wall and brought it down across the cage. The ribs shattered like dry kindling. The heart hit the packed earth floor and burst, spilling a tarry fluid that hissed where it touched wood. The lanterns outside guttered all at once, as though the swamp itself had drawn breath. Then the screaming began. Not from throats, but from everywhere, the trees, the water, the ground beneath his feet. The compound erupted into chaos. Figures staggered from the temple clutching their heads, skin splitting along old seams, blood running black in the lightning. The patriarch stood in the doorway of the big house, faces on his coat peeling away one by one, mouths working soundlessly as the flesh beneath sagged and tore. He reached for Elijah with arms that lengthened, joints popping like green wood in fire, until something inside him cracked open and he folded in half the wrong way. The girl appeared beside Elijah, belly rippling with impossible movement. She pressed a hand to his cheek, leaving a bloody print. "It's done," she said, voice suddenly clear, almost musical. "Go." Behind her the family was coming apart, eyes bursting, teeth raining from jaws, bodies collapsing into wet piles that steamed in the rain. The swamp rushed in to claim them, water rising fast, black and hungry. Elijah ran. Branches clawed his face, roots snaked up to trip him, but the current carried him now, pushing, pulling, spitting him out into wider channels where the storm finally began to ease. When he looked back at dawn, there was only fog and the low, satisfied gurgle of water closing over a place that had never truly existed on any map.